The candle had been burning for 40 minutes when the old man opened his ledger. The hospital chapel smelled of antiseptic and beeswax, a combination that had defined Tuesday mornings at Whitmore Regional Medical Center for 19 years. The overhead fluorescents were dimmed at this hour, the room lit instead by the single pillar candle he placed on the altar table each time he arrived, and by the thin winter light pressing through frosted glass on the east wall. The HVAC system exhaled steadily above him, a low institutional hum that had become, over time, as familiar to him as his own breathing. He had stopped hearing it the way a man stops hearing the rhythm of his own heart. The pew beneath him was worn smooth at the center where decades of the hospital's visitors had shifted and resettled their weight, and the faint smell of communion candles from services past had worked itself permanently into the wood grain sweet and slightly waxy underneath the antiseptic that no amount of mopping could fully displace. He sat in the second pew from the front, both feet flat on the floor, back straight. Not rigidly, there was no tension in it, but with the settled verticality of a man whose body had long ago decided that certain postures were simply how it held itself. His shoulders were broad and dark, the kind of frame that carries years without collapsing under them. A man who had once moved through jungle in the dark on less sleep than any civilian would consider functional, still had the bearing that training had installed, and neither time nor circumstance had found a way to entirely remove it. His white clerical collar sat against a neck lined with age, and the hands he folded on the open ledger were large and deliberate, the hands of someone who had once been paid to be precise with them and had never quite let that go. On the pew beside him, resting against his coat, was a key ring. From it hung a challenge coin, copper-colored, worn smooth from decades of handling the insignia on its face, ground down to the barest suggestion of what it had once depicted. He had not looked at it this morning. He did not need to. He had carried that coin for 46 years, and the carrying of it had long since become the kind of habit that lives below thought, the way a person carries grief, or certainty, or love not consciously but continuously. He looked at the ledger instead. It was a black composition notebook, the kind sold in drugstores for $3, and this one was nearly full. Its corners were soft and rounded from years of opening and closing. A rubber band held it shut when he carried it. He had removed the rubber band and set it on the pew. The pages had thickened over time, as pages do when they have been written on and read and touched again, and the notebook had taken on a slight bow at the spine. Inside it were names, 94 of them each with a date and a single line. Some of the lines were short. Some needed more room than a single line allows, and he had given them more room anyway, writing smaller to fit the margin. He had not told anyone about the ledger. He did not consider it something that required announcing. It existed because the names required recording, and he was the one doing the recording. He turned to the most recent entry, R. Holt, Day 4. He wrote it, and then he stopped writing, his pen still resting on the page. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned back 2 pages to an entry from 16 years prior. The ink there was older, slightly faded, but still legible, R. Holt, 2009, and beneath the date in his careful hand the colonel who came back. He had not known when he wrote that line in 2009 that the colonel would come back a second time. He had not known 4 days ago when a nurse named Reeves had recognized the name on the admission sheet and walked down to the chapel to tell him that the man in room 4 of the intensive care unit was the same man whose name lived in this ledger and whose face Gideon had not seen in any significant way since a fire base in Quang Tri Province in 1971. 53 years and a full life, and now here in Beaumont, Texas, in the same hospital where Abraham Gideon had spent 19 years learning that there were things a man could give another person that had no official category and no line on a budget. He sat with the thought of it. He did not press on it. Some things deserved to be carried lightly even when they were heavy, He closed the ledger and set it on the side table where it always lived when he was in the chapel. The table was small and wooden, scarred with rings from previous candle holders, and it had become over the years an extension of the chapel itself. Visitors left things on it, sometimes notes and photographs, and once a folded flag, and Gideon had developed the habit of checking it first thing the way a postmaster checks his counter. This morning it held only the ledger and a folded program from the previous Sunday's interfaith service which someone had left and which he would throw away on his way out, because this was the kind of small maintenance that no one assigned and he had assigned to himself. He looked up at the door. Above it, mounted in the upper corner of the frame, was a small security camera. It had been installed 2 years ago after a medication had gone missing from the nurses' station adjacent to the chapel entrance, and the hospital had decided that a camera here where access was relatively unrestricted was a reasonable precaution. Gideon had been consulted at the time out of courtesy since the chapel was in some sense his, and he had said he had no objection. The small red light at its base blinked at a steady interval, neither fast nor slow, the way a lighthouse blinks, not urgent, just present. He had long since stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing anything that becomes permanent, anything that has been there long enough to belong. He stood. He was 67 years old, and he rose from the pew the way a man rises when he has no particular reason to hurry, but also no reason to linger. He walked to the altar table, checked that the candle was stable in its holder, and stood for a moment with his hand near but not touching the flame. Not praying exactly. Settling. This was the part of the morning he did not explain to people who asked about his process, because the part they were asking about was the visible part. The visits, the ledger, the sitting with patients, and this part was prior to all of that. This part was how he arrived. It was the thing that made the rest possible, and it had no name that he used for it. Then he picked up his keyring, put the ledger under his arm, and walked out into the corridor to begin his rounds. This was Tuesday. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Had for 19 years. In 2005, when he had first proposed the program to the hospital administration, the chief of medicine had endorsed his letter. A man named Beauchamp, who had watched Gideon sit with a dying patient for 11 unbroken hours before he decided the proposal was worth signing. Beauchamp had told him later, "I wasn't sure what you were doing at first. Then I understood." The program now served 340 patients annually. Gideon had not received a salary for any of it. He had not asked for one. The asking had never crossed his mind, not because he was indifferent to compensation, but because compensation had never been the architecture of this particular thing. The nurses on the morning shift greeted him by name. The orderlies nodded. The floor in the east corridor was always slightly sticky near the supply closet, and he stepped around it without looking out of habit. He knew this building the way he knew his own hands, not because he had mapped it consciously, but because 19 years of the same corridors on the same days in the same seasons had deposited the building's geography into his body, into the angle at which he turned corners and the timing of his steps on the stairs, and the way he angled his shoulder to fit through the doorframe of room 12 West without looking. He visited 3 patients before 9 in the morning, a woman recovering from a knee replacement who wanted to talk about her grandson's school situation, which was complicated in ways she found worrying, and who needed someone to track the complications with her for 20 minutes without offering solutions. A man in his 50s with a diagnosis that had arrived 3 weeks ago and had not yet fully landed for him. It was still floating above him, not yet attached, and he talked about it in the third person as if describing something happening to a character in a story. A teenage girl who had been admitted for something unrelated to her grief and who needed someone to sit near the window with her while she looked out at the parking lot and said nothing because the nothing needed company, the same way the words needed it. At 9 o'clock, he went to room 4 of the intensive care unit. The man in the bed was 79 years old and did not look it except in the way a man looks diminished by a bed that is not sized for what he was. He was thin now the way illness makes a person thin, not from loss of mass, but from loss of density, as though something interior had been quietly removed, as though the illness had been going room by room through the house of him and taking what it wanted. The IV line ran into his left forearm. The monitors beeped at their measured intervals. He wore a hospital gown that was pale blue and slightly too large across the shoulder and against his sternum on a thin chain that had no business being there. Under hospital policy hung a set of military dog tags. 2 tags on a single chain resting against the pale blue fabric, their edges dull from decades of contact with cloth and skin. Gideon looked at the tags for a moment, at the worn metal, at the way they rested against the man's chest with the casual permanence of something that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. Then he looked at the man's face. Holt opened his eyes. He said, "I told Reeves not to make a fuss." His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who had once needed to project it across noise and had kept its register even after the noise was long gone. It was the voice of someone who had given orders for 34 years and then retired and kept the voice even after the orders stopped, because the voice was not a function of rank, it was a function of who he was. Gideon sat in the chair beside the bed. He did not respond to the comment about Reeves. He placed his ledger on his knee and his keyring beside it, and he folded his hands. "I am not making a fuss," he said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no particular urgency. "I am sitting." Holt looked at the ceiling. His jaw was set in the particular way of a man who does not intend to be sentimental about what is happening to him and is succeeding at the intention mostly. He had been a colonel for 16 years. He had taken his troops to 3 different theaters and had brought back most of them, and had carried the ones he hadn't brought back in the way that men in that profession carry those particular weights present unspoken, not unacknowledged, just not discussed. He had been the kind of officer his soldiers trusted, not because he told them to trust him, but because he never asked them to do something he would not do himself. That quality had followed him into the bed and into the illness, and it was with him now in the way he looked at the ceiling, instead of at the tube in his arm, in the way he did not ask Gideon to tell him it would be all right. They sat in silence for 20 minutes, and neither of them found the silence uncomfortable because they had both spent time in places where silence was not an absence of sound, but a specific and inhabited thing. A thing with texture and weight, a thing that 2 people could share, the way they share a room. At 21 minutes, Holt said, "They tell me I've got a window." Gideon said, "Reeves told me the same." "A window," Holt said again, like he was testing the word, like he was deciding whether it was the right word for the thing it described, "means they don't know. Just that it's closing." Gideon did not disagree. Holt's eyes moved to the dog tags resting on his chest and then away. He did not offer any explanation for them, and Gideon did not ask. There would be time for what needed to be said. Or there would not be time, and what needed to be said would find another form the way things do when the usual form is not available. He had learned this in 19 years of this work, that intention finds a way when the person holding it has carried it long enough to know what it is. Gideon left at 10:20 and walked back through the east corridor toward the chapel. He was thinking about what Holt had said about the window and about the particular courage required to look at a closing window and call it what it is. He had seen people spend the last of their conscious time refusing to name the thing that was happening, and he had watched them carry that refusal as a burden on top of all the other burdens. Holt was not doing that. Holt was calling the window a window. He had always admired directness. He supposed he had learned some of his own from places not entirely different from where Holt had learned his. He did not know that at 11:43, while he was completing a note in his ledger, a black and white patrol vehicle was pulling into the hospital's main entrance parking lot. He did not know the name of the man behind the wheel. He did not know that the man's confidence had been constructed over 8 years of entering rooms and never being held responsible for what he did inside them. or that this confidence had the particular brittleness of things that have never been tested. He did not know any of this. He was sitting in the chapel in the second pew from the front with the ledger open on his knee, writing a single line under R. Holt, Day 4. The colonel does not need praying, he needs company. He had just closed the ledger and was sitting quietly. His hands folded the candle, doing what candles do in rooms that need something warm and living in them when the chapel door opened. Officer Craig Metz was 36 years old and built in a way that was often described by people who were trying to be polite about it as imposing. He was thick through the neck and through the chest, and through the opinion he held of himself, which was the most substantial thing about him. His uniform was pressed, and his boots were clean, and his cap sat on his head at the precise angle that suggested authority rather than displaying it, which is the angle men choose when they are not certain the authority is actually there, and believe the angle might compensate for the uncertainty. He had been called to Whitmore Regional at 11:22 for a disturbance involving a patient's family member who had become agitated near the discharge desk, a misunderstanding about a form, the kind of thing that happened when people were frightened and tired, and the paperwork made it worse. Metz had handled it efficiently. Not gently, he did not have a gear for gently in this kind of situation, but efficiently. The family member had calmed. The form had been located. The discharge had been processed. The matter was by 11:38 resolved. He did not leave. This was a thing he did, and the nursing staff at Whitmore Regional had learned over 8 years that it was easier to let him do it than to explain each time that there was no need. He moved through the corridors with the particular gait of a man touring territory he considers his to tour, stopping to look at things without touching them, nodding at staff who made the mistake of making eye contact opening doors to look into rooms and then closing them again. He did not understand why the nursing staff did not welcome this. He interpreted their tolerance as approval and their silence as agreement, which is a thing that certain men do when they need to interpret silence as something other than what it is. There were 2 prior complaints in his file from this hospital alone. The first had come from a nurse who had watched him speak to a black orderly in a tone that had nothing to do with any security matter, and everything to do with the way some people deploy a uniform when they are speaking to people they have decided are below them. The second had come from a family member in the oncology wing, a woman in her 60s, whose son had just been given a terminal diagnosis, who had needed 5 minutes of Metz's routine presence to tell her he could not help her, and that she needed to move to a different waiting area, and who had described his manner afterward as the cruelest thing that had happened to her in a week full of cruel things. Both complaints had been filed with the precinct. Neither had resulted in any formal consequence. They sat in a folder that no one had opened since the day they were received, gathering the particular dust of things that have been documented but not addressed. He entered the hospital chapel at 11:47. The room was dim and quiet, the candles still burning on the altar table, the HVAC breathing its steady breath. The smell of beeswax and antiseptic reached him at the door, and he did not register it as anything other than hospital smell, which was a single, undifferentiated category for him. In the second pew from the front, an elderly woman sat with her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned slightly downward. She was 83 years old. Her name was Mrs. Prather, and she had come out of surgery 31 hours ago, and had been told that the recovery would be slow and that she should rest. She had not been able to rest, and her room hospitals at night make a sound that is not restful, a combination of the machinery of care and the evidence of need, and Mrs. Prather had found it overwhelming. She had asked a nurse if she could come to the chapel. The nurse had walked her down personally and had asked Gideon, who was already there, to sit with her. Gideon was seated beside Mrs. Prather, leaning slightly toward her, speaking in a voice low enough that it barely reached the next pew. His posture was the posture of someone who is giving another person his full attention without performing the giving of it. He did not look up immediately when the door opened, because doors opened in chapels. People came and went. That was the nature of chapels. He finished his sentence to Mrs. Prather. Then he looked up. Metz said chapel needs to clear. His voice was level and not especially loud, the voice of a man who had given this kind of instruction enough times that it had become an ordinary thing to say, a thing that expected compliance before resistance. He did not offer a reason. He stood in the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his weight settled back on his heels, which was a posture Gideon had seen before in men who want to appear larger than the doorway they are standing in. Gideon looked at him without expression. He placed his hand on Mrs. Prather's arm, lightly, briefly, a signal that communicated without words. I see this. I am not afraid of it. And I am still here. Then he stood. He was standing before Metz had time to repeat himself, and the slight recalibration on Metz's face suggested he had expected the standing to take longer to come with some negotiation or protest, and the absence of that negotiation required him to move to his next position faster than he had anticipated. Gideon reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced his volunteer badge. It was laminated with a photograph and the Whitmore Regional Medical Center seal and the words, Chaplain C Program, Authorized Volunteer, printed clearly beneath his name. He held it out with the patience of a man who has presented documents many times and understood that the presenting was important even when the receiving was going to be inadequate. He had learned this patience in a different context, in a different era, in situations where the stakes of presenting documents incorrectly had been considerably higher than this. The patience was the same. The stakes were different. He held the badge steady. He said, My name is Pastor Abraham Gideon. I have been a registered volunteer chaplain at this hospital for 19 years. I am here with a patient at her request. The badge is active and current. If you have a question about my authorization, the volunteer coordinator can be reached at extension 411. Metz looked at the badge. He did not take it. His expression did not change in the way that expressions change when they are receiving information they intend to act on. It changed the way expressions change when the information has been discarded and a different thing is being decided. He said volunteers don't count as staff. You don't have authority here. The chapel authority is the hospital's. Gideon said his tone even and without heat. I am operating under the hospital's chaplaincy program. If you have a security concern about this floor, I am happy to step aside while you address it. I will wait outside the door, but this woman asked for spiritual support, and I am providing it. Metz stepped into the chapel. He took 2 steps toward the pew. The 2 steps were not necessary for communication. They were a message in themselves. He was inside the room now, not at the door. He had reduced the distance between himself and the man he was speaking to, which is a thing you do when you want the other person to feel the reduction. He said, I don't know what kind of wandering preacher setup this is, but there's a security concern on this floor and non-essential personnel need to vacate. That includes you. He said wandering preacher the way a man says a phrase he has been holding, not improvised in the moment, not casual, but placed deliberately in the specific register that says, I have a certain opinion of what you are, and I would like you to understand that opinion. He said it in front of Mrs. Prather, who had opened her eyes and was watching with the stillness of a person who has understood that the stillness is important. He said it in front of 2 nurses who had entered the chapel from the side corridor at 11:49, drawn by some instinct that nurses develop about rooms where things are not right. A quality of attention they learn from years of reading vital signs extended to reading rooms. Mrs. Prather's hands in her lap tightened slightly. Metz continued, I don't know what you're doing alone with patients, but it doesn't look right. This is a medical facility, not some kind of personal ministry. You need to go. What he was implying did not require being stated plainly. It was there in the phrasing and in the look he directed at the space between Gideon and the elderly woman in the pew, as though the proximity itself demanded explanation, as though the proximity was the concern and not Metz's own behavior. Gideon had encountered this implication before. He had encountered it in other rooms in other years, from other men wearing other uniforms, and he had learned that the correct response to it was not to respond to it directly, because responding to it gave it the weight of an actual accusation, which it was not. It was a weapon someone had constructed from an implication. The way to disarm it was to decline to pick it up. He said, "I will make note of this conversation." His voice had not changed. It was the same resonant baritone he had used to say every word in this room since Metz had entered it. There was nothing theatrical in the statement. There was no warning designed to seem like a warning. It was simply the factual statement of a man who intended to do exactly what he said he would do, and who had learned from 19 years of this work from 2 tours before, that from a life lived in a country that had required him to document his own existence in ways that his white counterparts had never been asked to document theirs, that the note-taking was not a weapon, but it was not nothing either. Metz placed his hand on Gideon's arm. It was not a hard grip. It was the grip of a man who has learned that physical contact is a clarifying move, that it establishes direction, that it ends the ambiguity about who is controlling the motion of the situation. He applied it to Gideon's upper arm, just above the elbow, and he steered him toward the chapel door with the practiced ease of someone who has done this before and has not once been held responsible for it. Gideon did not resist. He moved. He moved with the steady composure of a man who had once been trained to remain functional under conditions that would unravel most people, and who understood that the time to act was not always the moment of provocation. He let himself be guided through the chapel door and into the corridor. He walked out straight, both feet flat on the floor, back straight. Mrs. Prather watched him go. She did not say anything. She sat in the pew with her hands in her lap, and she watched the door close after him. And something in her face settled into a kind of stillness that was not peace, but its opposite. The stillness that arrives when a person has witnessed something that cannot be unwitnessed and is deciding what to do with the witnessing. One of the 2 nurses, she had worked with Gideon for 11 years and had watched him sit with her own father-in-law during a week that had nearly broken her family, and had never once mentioned it afterward because it was not a thing he did. For acknowledgement reached under the nurse's station counter and found her phone. She sent a text to the charge nurse at 12:03 Metz, just removed the chaplain. The second nurse walked back to her station and opened the incident report form. She typed quickly and without pausing to consider her word choices, because she had been watching for years and the word choices were already decided. She filed at 12:41. The first nurse filed hers at 12:58. In the parking lot, Metz sat in his vehicle and typed his report on the in-car terminal. He described the situation in 4 sentences. He described Gideon as an unauthorized individual found in a restricted patient area. He described the resolution as the individual being escorted out for protocol reasons. He did not mention the badge. He did not mention the 19 years. He did not mention his hand on Gideon's arm. He submitted the report at 1:04 p.m. and drove away believing that the situation had been handled. He had not handled it. He had created a record. 2 nurses who had watched Abraham Gideon sit with dying people for a combined 31 years were writing their accounts time-stamped, formal, precise, and resting on a desk that Metz did not know existed. Above the chapel door, the small red light blinked at its interval. Steady, unhurried marking time the way it always did, without judgment and without forgetting. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the hospital's administrator on duty received Metz's report. His name was David Hale, and he was 38, and he was the kind of administrator who operated by protocol, the way some men operate by reflex, not because he lacked judgment, but because the protocol was clear, and his judgment told him to follow clear things. The clarity was not malicious. It was the clarity of a man who has been given a set of procedures for handling situations and has not yet encountered a situation in which the procedures were more harmful than their absence. When he read the report about an unauthorized individual in the chapel, he looked up the volunteer access procedures. The procedures stated that any report of an unauthorized individual in a patient area required a badge suspension pending review. He found Gideon's volunteer file. He generated the suspension order. He sent it to the badge management system at 2:44. He had not spoken to anyone in the chaplaincy program. He had not pulled Gideon's badge log to see when the badge had last been used and whether there were any gaps in the record. He had not called extension 411. He had followed the procedure correctly, starting from a premise that was false, and the machine had done exactly what the machine was designed to do. This is the particular cruelty of procedure untethered from inquiry. It functions perfectly while producing outcomes that its designers never intended. In the administrative waiting area on the second floor, Gideon sat with his coat folded on his knee and his ledger on top of it, and his hands folded on top of that. He had been asked to wait for the review. He was waiting. The chair was standard institutional issue, padded in a neutral gray, and it held him the way a chair holds a man who is not agitated without effort because no effort was required. He was not performing patience. He simply had it in the way that men have it when they have spent years in rooms where the only alternative to patience was making things worse. He had been told there had been a complaint. He had not been told the nature of the complaint or the name of the person who had made it, because Hale had been careful to say only what protocol required him to say. Gideon had listened. He had not pushed for more information, not because he didn't want it, but because he understood that the wanting of it was not the same as the needing of it, and that the review would produce what the review would produce, regardless of how much information he accumulated in the waiting area. He sat, and he thought about Holt, whose window was measured in hours, and he thought about Mrs. Prather, who had been alone in the chapel when he left it, and he thought about the challenge coin on his keyring, which he had pressed between his thumb and forefinger, without realizing he had taken it out. He was thinking about a specific kind of light. It was not the light in the waiting area which was fluorescent and flat and made everything in it look like evidence. It was the light from 1971 from Quang Tri Province, from a morning that had begun before dawn and had changed before the sun was fully up. The memory did not arrive with announcement. It came the way those memories come when the present has applied enough pressure to the past to break the wall between them, not as a flashback exactly, but as a presence, the way a smell can fill a room before you have identified what you are smelling. He had been 24 years old. The fire base had been attacked before first light, and the lieutenant, a man he had known for 6 months, a man from Kentucky who said ma'am to everyone, including the commanding officer, a man who had once spent his entire 48-hour leave hunting for a specific kind of pepper sauce that reminded him of his grandmother's cooking. That man was on the ground with a wound that had made the arithmetic very clear. 6 hours before medevac. The arithmetic was simple but not easy. He had worked for 6 hours. He had done the things he had been trained to do, and some things he figured out as he went, and some things he did on instinct that he would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked him to explain them afterward. He had not known during those 6 hours whether it would be enough. He had done the work anyway, because the work in front of you is the only work that exists. The lieutenant had survived. He had gone on to become a colonel. He was in room 4 of the intensive care unit, 2 floors above this waiting area, and his window was measured in hours. At 3:14, a door opened at the far end of the corridor. Sandra Reeves had worked as the ICU charge nurse at Whitmore Regional for 22 years. She was 51, compact and quick-moving, and she had a face that generally maintained the expression of a person who has seen most things and is prepared to see most other things. She was not a demonstrative person. She did not use language loosely. When she walked toward Gideon through the administrative waiting area, her face carried an expression that he had learned to read over 11 years of working alongside her, the expression of a woman who is about to deliver information that matters, and is not going to soften it because softening it would make it less true. She sat in the chair beside him without preamble. She said, "He is asking for you. Holt. Specifically you, not any of the other chaplains, not the floor chaplain. You." He said your name. Gideon looked at her. She said, "The attending has been watching the numbers change for the last 4 hours. The window, the time when he can speak when he knows who is in the room with him, they are estimating it closes somewhere between 4:30 and 6. That is not a wide window, and it is 3:14 right now. He was quiet for a beat, then he stood. Reeves stood with him. They walked together through the second-floor corridor and down the stairs to the ICU wing, and the walking was quick without being urgent. The pace of two people who know the arithmetic and are not wasting time, but are also not running from it. The badge reader at the ICU entry was mounted on the right side of the doorframe. Gideon removed his badge from his jacket pocket and held it to the reader. The light flashed red. He held it there for a moment as though giving the system a chance to correct itself. Then he withdrew the badge and looked at it. The badge was the same badge it had been this morning when he had signed in at 6:58. The badge had not changed. Something in the system had changed, and the system was between him and the room where a man was running out of time to say whatever he had decided to say. He held the badge to the reader again. Red. He did not react visibly. He was not performing composure. He simply had it in the deep structural way the way a building has load-bearing walls that do not move regardless of what the weather is doing outside. He turned to Reeves. He said, "Tell me what I need to do." His voice was measured. There was no shake in it and no edge of panic, and Reeves would later tell the nurses who asked her about it that the thing that had stayed with her was not how calm he looked, but how present he was. Not calm in the sense of removed, not placid, but completely and deliberately here engaged with the problem of the badge reader, the way he was engaged with everything as a thing requiring thought and action rather than emotion. Reeves turned without another word and walked back down the corridor toward Hale's office. Gideon stayed at the ICU door. He did not pace. He did not call out for anyone. He stood with his coat folded over one arm and his badge in his hand, and he looked through the long, narrow window set into the door. The kind of window designed to allow nurses to check corridor clearance. Not large enough to be a view, but present enough to be a reminder. He could see the corridor inside. He could see the nurses' station and the room numbers above the doors and through the glass panel of room 4 ICU. He could see the shape of the bed, the monitor's glow above it, and the particular stillness of a person lying there while time moved at its own rate and made no accommodation for who was on the other side of the glass. He thought, if I had 6 hours and 71, I have less than 2 now. He thought this without despair, which was the way he thought about most things. Despair was a conclusion, and he had not arrived at the conclusion yet. He was still in the middle of the problem. The middle of the problem was where the work was. Inside, a first-year nurse named Taylor noticed him at the window. She was 24 and had been on this unit for 7 months, and she had not yet built the complete interior wall that the work eventually builds in people who stay the wall that is not indifference, but is the thing that makes it possible to be both fully present and fully functional at the same time. She looked at the man on the other side of the glass, and she could not entirely identify what she was seeing. The composure, the stillness, the way he was simply there, not pressing against the glass, not gesturing for someone inside, just standing. She moved to the window. He gave her a small nod. It was the smallest possible communication, barely a movement, and it said, "It is all right." Not that the situation was all right, not that he was not aware of what was at stake, but that she should not carry distress on his behalf, and that whatever she was feeling, the carrying of it was not required. She stepped back from the window. Down the corridor, Reeves had arrived at Hale's office. The door was open. Hale was on the phone. She stood in the doorway. Hale saw her. He held up a finger. She did not move. She did not indicate that she had received the gesture. She stood in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had cleared obstructed airways and run cardiac codes and delivered diagnoses that changed the shape of families forever, and who did not consider a phone call to be an obstacle of any consequence. The protocol required a supervisor sign-off to reinstate a suspended badge. The supervisor was in a board-level meeting. The badge system did not allow floor-level override. The clock at the end of the corridor read 3:34. 20 minutes since Holt's request had been relayed. The window of consciousness was measured not in minutes, but in what was left of them. Gideon stood at the door. His hand was in his coat pocket, and the challenge coin was in his hand, its worn face pressing against his palm, its insignia barely legible, the name of the unit it represented almost entirely, erased by years of this exact contact. He had carried it through 2 tours and a life, and now a Tuesday in a hospital corridor in Beaumont, Texas. And it was the same coin it had always been, and he was the same man, and the door in front of him was a different kind of obstacle than the ones he had been trained for. But it was still an obstacle, and the approach to it was the same, not force, not panic, but the steady, patient, deliberate application of presence to the problem until the problem moved. He waited. In the hospital's legal department on the 4th floor, Patricia Okoro had not planned to work through the afternoon. She was the hospital's general counsel, 54 years old, with a precise and unhurried intelligence that expressed itself in the way she read documents, slowly, fully the first time through, with nothing written until the reading was complete. She had been at her desk reviewing an unrelated contract when her assistant forwarded her the 2 nurses' incident reports at 3:40 flagged as requiring her review based on their language, which used words her assistant had flagged. Credentialed volunteer physical contact removed from patient's bedside. She read the first report through once, then the second. Then she pulled up Metz's report, which had arrived through the precinct's standard channel at approximately 1:30, and she laid all 3 on her screen. They described the same event from 2 different planets. The nurses' accounts were specific, dated, time-stamped, and written in the language of people who had been observing with their full attention and were reporting what they had observed. Metz's account was written in the language of someone describing an event that had been resolved before it became interesting. The 2 accounts were not merely different in emphasis. They were incompatible. One of them was not an interpretation of events. One of them was a fabrication. She went to the chapel camera system at 3:45. She found the recording from 11:47. She watched it once with her full attention, her hands flat on the desk, nothing in them, her eyes on the screen. She watched the sequence from beginning to end. The entry, the conversation, the badge presentation, the specific phrase, the physical contact, the door. She rewound one section and watched it again. She did not need to watch it a 3rd time. She pulled Gideon's badge log. He had entered the building at 6:58 that morning. His badge had registered at 4 distinct access points across the hospital throughout the day. Chapel Entry East Corridor, ICU check-in, administrative waiting area. The log was a chain of documented authorized access unbroken, starting before 7 in the morning. The word unauthorized, as Metz had used it in his report, was not a mistake or an overstatement. It was a fabrication. It was the kind of fabrication that happens when a person does not expect anyone to check. She opened Metz's prior complaint file. She had seen it before. She had written a letter to the precinct after the 2nd complaint recommending formal review. She had been thanked. Nothing had happened. She looked at the file now with the clarity that arrives when something you foresaw and warned about has occurred. Not satisfaction, nothing like satisfaction, but a grim recognition that was its own kind of emotion, different from all the others. She picked up the phone and called the hospital's CEO. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, she had the authorization she needed and she began writing. At 3:58 p.m., the badge management system updated. The suspension on Abraham Gideon's volunteer access was lifted, not suspended, pending further review, not conditionally reinstated, but fully lifted with a notation that the original suspension had been generated in error based on a complaint that had been found upon initial review to be unsupported by the hospital's own documentation. At the same moment, Sandra Reeves was moving down the 2nd floor corridor at a pace that was not running, but had the character of something close to it. She had Hale's verbal authorization. He had ended the phone call as soon as she made the situation plain to him, and the plainness of it had reached him clearly, and she was not waiting for it to be written. She came around the corner and saw Gideon at the ICU door. She said, "Try it." He did not ask what had changed. He removed the badge from his pocket and held it to the reader. The light turned green. The door release mechanism clicked. He pressed the door open with his forearm and walked through. The sound of the ICU came in with him, the monitors, the ventilation system, the soft, low conversation from the nurse's station, the particular quality of air in a space where the work of maintaining life is being performed continuously and at close range. He walked down the corridor with both feet flat on the floor, back straight, moving at the same unhurried pace he had kept all day. Not because the pace was appropriate to the urgency, but because the urgency was inside him and the pace was what he could control. He entered room 4 ICU at 4:03 p.m. Holt's eyes were closed. His breathing had changed, not labored, not painful seeming, but different in the way that breathing changes when the body has made a decision and is implementing it. The monitors were steady. The room was quiet, with the particular quiet of a room in which the important things are happening quietly. The afternoon light had shifted in the hours since the morning. The sun was lower now. The light through the window warmer and more diffuse, the gold-orange of late afternoon, pressing gently through the blinds and laying itself in stripes across the bed. Gideon sat in the chair beside the bed without making a sound. He placed his ledger on the window ledge and his key ring beside it. He took Holt's hand. The hand was thin. The skin over the knuckles was loose in the way that hands become when they have spent decades doing the physical work of a soldier and a man, and the work has finished. It was cool, not cold. Holding it felt like holding something that was still fully present but was in the process of preparing to be something else, the way a building feels just before it stops being a building. He held it. He sat with both feet flat on the floor, back straight, and he was present in the way that 19 years of this work had taught him to be present, not managing his own responses, not monitoring the room for what would come next, but simply here in the chair in the afternoon light with his hand around the hand of a man who had asked for him specifically and had been waiting. He thought about what it meant that Holt had carried his name for 54 years. He thought about this without sentimentality, which was the way he thought about most meaningful things. He had not known about the dog tags. He knew they were there. He had seen them on the chain against the pale blue hospital gown, and had chosen not to ask about them the same way he chose not to ask about the things his patients carried until they were ready to explain them. He had not known what was on the back. He had not known that the man in the bed had decided at some point in 1971 that the name of the medic who had kept him alive for 6 hours was worth carrying on his body as long as his body existed to carry anything. He sat and he held the hand. At 4:11, Holt opened his eyes. He turned his head on the pillow and he looked at Gideon. The look lasted for a moment before it became something else, before the recognition settled in and changed the quality of his face in the way that recognition changes a face, removing the tension of uncertainty and replacing it with the particular stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere they had not been certain they would arrive. Not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly, something prior to both of those things. The look of a man who, after everything, is not alone. He did not say anything. He looked at Gideon. Gideon held his hand and looked back. The monitor beeped. Outside the window, a slow afternoon cloud moved across the Texas sky, and the light in the room shifted for a moment cooler, then returned to its warm, diffuse self. Nurse Taylor at the station at the end of the corridor glanced through the glass panel of room 4 and saw them, the old man in the bed and the older man in the chair beside it. The held hand, the quality of presence between them that she could see even at a distance. And she looked away because some things are private, not in the sense of being hidden, but in the sense of belonging entirely to the people involved in them, and witnessing them from the outside is an intrusion even when the witness has every right to be there. In another part of the hospital, Patricia Okoro was writing the first of 3 letters that would end a career. She wrote slowly and with care, and when she was done writing, she read each letter once and then sent it. In room 4I, CU, Abraham Gideon was holding the hand of a man who had carried his name for 54 years. Neither of them knew what the other was doing. Both of them were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. That was the difference between them and Craig Metz, who had been doing neither. At 5:30 p.m., the monitor in room 4 ICU changed its tone. Reeves moved immediately from the station. Taylor moved with her. Gideon stayed in his chair beside the bed, because staying was the right thing, and Reeves knew it was the right thing, and she did not ask him to move. In the time since 4:11, when Holt had opened his eyes and found what he was looking for, he had been awake twice more. The second time, at 4:42, he had spoken. He had turned his head on the pillow, and he had said 4 words to Gideon directed at him with the precision of a man who had always delivered important things precisely, who had never confused important with complicated, who understood that the most significant things a person says can often be said in the fewest words. The story does not report those 4 words. They belonged to the room, and what belongs to a room stays there. Gideon had nodded when he heard them. He had not spoken. He had held the hand. At 5:30, Holt passed quietly. When the necessary work of the nurses was done, Reeves moved to the bedside to remove the personal effects per protocol. She removed the identification bracelet. She removed the watch from the left wrist. She reached for the dog tags. The chain came over Holt's head easily. She held the tags in her palm for a moment. Before logging them, she always took a moment with personal effects, not out of sentimentality, but out of something else, something that had no name and did not need one. She looked at the front of the primary tag. Name, serial number, blood type, religion. She logged it. Then she turned it over. She read what was on the back. She read it again. She turned to Gideon, who was still in the chair beside the bed, his hand now folded in his lap, his face holding the expression of a man who has been present for something that cannot be summed up and will not try to sum it up. She held the tag out toward him so that he could see. He leaned forward. A Gideon, his own name engraved in the precise, deep lettering of military record-keeping. Not decorative, not ceremonial, but functional, the way you mark something when you intend it to last. The letters were sharp-edged and had not worn because they had been protected for 54 years by the warmth of the body that carried them pressed against a sternum through Vietnam and the Gulf and Bosnia and 34 years of service and retirement and widowing and estrangement, and a final diagnosis and 4 days in room 4 of the intensive care unit of a hospital in Beaumont, Texas. 3 days before he lost the ability to speak, Holt had told Reeves about the tags. He had said in the matter-of-fact tone he used for everything important, "I promised myself I would carry him until I didn't need to anymore." He had not explained who he was. Reeves had not asked. She had understood from the tone that it was a promise of the kind that a man makes to himself in a moment of extremity, in a place where extremity is the ordinary condition, and that the keeping of the promise had required nothing more and nothing less than continued existence. Gideon read the name. He sat with it. He sat with the full weight of what was in his hand and the full weight of what it meant, and the full weight of what had almost not happened. The badge reader, the 24 minutes at the door, the bureaucratic chain of a false report becoming a suspension, becoming a locked door between a man and his last conscious request. He sat with the proximity of the thing that had almost happened and the fact that it had not. Then he closed his hand around the tag. He did not speak. He did not explain. His face did not perform what he was feeling because what he was feeling was the kind of thing that cannot be performed. It can only be held the way you hold something precious and heavy and entirely yours in the cupped palm of both hands, very still for as long as it takes. The room was quiet. The monitor had been silenced. The afternoon light through the window had turned toward evening, softer now, the gold gone out of it. The sky beyond the blinds going the deep blue of a winter dusk in southeast Texas. Nurse Taylor stood at the edge of the room. She was 24 years old, and she had been on this unit for 7 months, and she had not yet accumulated enough of these moments to know what to do with them when they arrived. She looked at the man in the chair with his hand closed around the dog tag, and she thought, I will be thinking about this for the rest of my life. She was right. At 6:14 p.m., Officer Craig Metz was summoned to the Internal Affairs Office. He was not told the specifics. He drove to the precinct with the settled confidence of a man who has learned over 8 years that the complaints move through the machinery and come out the other side as resolved incidents, that the record exists but does not accumulate, that the institutional reflex is to absorb and continue. He had been called in before. He was not worried. He was, if anything, mildly irritated at the interruption because it was the end of his shift and he had plans. He sat down across from an officer he knew, a woman named Delaney, who placed her laptop on the table between them, turned it so he could see the screen, and pressed play. The chapel camera footage began. He watched himself enter the chapel. He watched himself deliver the commands. He watched his own mouth form the words, and in the flat institutional light of the IA office with the footage playing from a laptop speaker, those words arrived with a weight they had not carried in the moment of their delivery. The weight of being heard the second time in a different room by different ears. They could not be explained as protocol. They could not be explained as procedure. They were what they were. He watched his hand come forward. He watched it close on the upper arm of a 67-year-old man who was wearing a laminated badge that said, Chaplaincy Program Authorized Volunteer, and who had done nothing except present that badge and ask for the name of the person to call. He watched himself steer that man toward the door. Delaney let it play through. Then she placed the nurse's reports on the table, then the badge log. Then she placed the 2 prior complaint files from Whitmore Regional. She said, You filed a report describing an unauthorized individual. His badge was logged in at 6:58 that morning. That is a false report, Officer Metz. The color left his face. Not gradually. Not in the slow way of managed shame. It left the way color leaves when the body understands before the mind does that the architecture of the situation has already been determined and is not subject to appeal. His complexion went from its normal, slightly flushed certainty to something closer to gray, and his hands, which had been resting with their usual settled confidence on the table, were no longer resting in that way. He looked at the laptop screen. He looked at the badge log. He looked at the 2 prior complaint files which he had believed were over, which he had understood to be resolved, which were not resolved, and had never been resolved, but were in fact a record that had been waiting patiently for this third thing to arrive and make them legible. He said nothing for a long time. There was nothing to say that the footage had not already said. Delaney did not fill the silence. She let it be what it was. There is a particular silence that falls over a man when he understands, not fears, but understands that the thing he thought he had controlled has been watching him from the beginning. Metz sat in that silence. He would sit in variations of it for the following 34 days. 11 days after the incident, the false report finding was formally confirmed. His suspension with pay became suspension without pay. The Texas Commission on Law Enforcement opened formal proceedings. The Civil Rights Review, a distinct process from the false report findings, slower and more deliberate, designed to examine patterns rather than incidents, ran alongside it in parallel. The hospital terminated its routine patrol agreement with the Beaumont Police Department. The letter cited the incident and the department's documented failure to act on prior complaints as grounds for the decision. The letter used language that was clear and unambiguous, and that would appear in the public record and in the legal department's files and in the 3 letters Patricia Okoro had sent to 3 separate oversight bodies, all of which had received the chapel footage. The nurse's reports, Gideon's badge log, and the prior complaint files, and none of which were in the business of losing paperwork. Metz's union filed a grievance. At the first-level hearing, the footage was entered as evidence. The grievance was denied. 18 incidents from Metz's prior service record involving black individuals in public spaces were flagged for review. The review was assigned to a team. The team began its work. On the 34th day after the incident, Metz was terminated. A criminal referral for filing a false police report was made simultaneously. The charge carried a potential misdemeanor penalty of a fine and up to 1 year. The civil rights case continued at its own pace, its outcome pending its record public and accessible to anyone who looked for it. His name appeared in the Texas Commission's database. It did not disappear. These things do not disappear. The record does not have a provision for disappearing, and the record does not care what a man believed about the permanence of his own authority. Sandra Reeves and a nurse named Carla Mees, who had filed the second incident report alone at her station at 1241, without discussion with anyone, because she had watched what she had watched, and knew what she knew, were formally recognized at the hospital's annual staff ceremony. The citation read for upholding the dignity of a patient's final hours. Reeves stood at the podium in the hospital's conference room and said thank you and nothing else. Mees nodded once from her chair. Neither of them had done what they did for the recognition. The recognition was the institution's way of saying it understood. They accepted it on behalf of that understanding, and nothing more. The following Tuesday, Gideon arrived at the hospital at 6:58. He signed in at the volunteer desk. The woman at the desk handed him his badge and said, "Good morning, the same as every Tuesday, the same as every Thursday, the same as it had been for 19 years. He said, "Good morning" back. He walked to the chapel. The corridor smelled of antiseptic, and the early air of a building before the day has fully arrived, cool, mechanical, underlaid by the ambient scent of a place where people come to be cared for, and the caring is continuous and never entirely stops. He knew this corridor. He knew the sticky patch near the supply closet, and the slight squeak of the fourth board from the east staircase, and the angle of morning light through the window at the end of the hall. He knew this building the way a person knows the inside of their own hands. He entered the chapel and stood for a moment in the quiet. He walked to the side table and set down his ledger and his coat and his keyring. He found the pillar candle in the drawer where it lived between visits. He placed it in the holder on the altar table and lit it. The flame steadied almost immediately. The chapel had good air circulation, a fact he had noticed years ago, and it held itself still and upright in the room's quiet air. He sat in the second pew from the front, both feet flat on the floor, back straight. He opened the ledger. The key ring rested beside him on the pew. The challenge coin pressed against the wood, its face worn smooth, its insignia, a ghost of what it had once been, present if you looked, gone if you didn't, which was about right. He did not look at it. He looked at the ledger, which was nearly full. 2 or 3 weeks of pages remained at the current rate. He had already bought the next one. It sat on his desk at home in its drugstore wrapper, waiting to become what this one had become, thick with names and dates and single lines warped at the spine from years of being carried and opened and closed, worn at the corners from the same. He turned to a fresh page. He did not turn back to look at R. Holt Day 8, the entry he had made the morning after. He did not need to. He had written it, and it was there, which was all that was required of it. The ledger's purpose was not to be revisited. It was to be added to. That was the work. He wrote a name, a date, a single line. The line said what it needed to say, which was one thing, only the one true thing he knew about the person the name belonged to. The thing that would remain true after everything else had changed. He had done this for 95 patients. He would do it for as long as he was able. This was not a decision he had made and might unmake. It was simply what Tuesday mornings were for. He closed the ledger. He sat for a while in the candlelight, in the early light pressing through the frosted glass. And he was not thinking about Metz, whose name was in a public database and would remain there in the permanent record of things that happened and were not undone. He was not thinking about the badge reader or the 24 minutes or the bureaucratic machinery that had nearly done the unbearable thing. He was thinking, if thinking was the right word, for the interior state of a man sitting quietly in a room he has occupied for 19 years, about the weight of a closed hand, about what it means to carry something for 54 years, about the difference between a promise made in a moment of extremity and a promise that endures past all the moments after it. If something in this story has stayed with you, if the ledger and the 19 years and the 4 words in a quiet room have found their way into you, the way true things do, then share it. The people who need to hear it will not find it unless you send it toward them. That is the only ask. That is enough. Above the chapel door, the small red light blinked at its steady interval. Neither fast nor slow. Not urgent, not performing urgency. Simply marking time, the way it had been marking time for 2 years. Steady, consistent recording what passed before it without judgment and without forgetting. A badge grants authority over the living. It carries no weight in the space between a dying man and the one person he asked for. That is a different kind of territory entirely, and some men are simply not equipped to enter it.